Hello everyone, my name is Elizabeth Manns and I'd like to welcome you to the April 4th Coalition Show. This is the June 5th, 2023 edition of the show and it is the 456th show that we have done since the closing of the North Adams Regional Hospital. The April 4th Coalition's mission statement is: we offer workers' rights and collective bargaining rights and are against tax breaks for the rich and corporations who ship our jobs overseas. We support all the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but as is our custom, we put the emphasis on Article 23 at the start of the show. Dick, which ones you want?
I'll do number 1 and number 3.
Okay.
All right. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and protection against unemployment.
Number 2, everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work.
Number 3, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family, or herself and her family, an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection.
Number 4, everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of her or his interests. And at this time, we usually do a thank you to Michael Putnam, who is the program director for WNBLP 107.1, which is our community radio, for airing the audio portion of our shows on Friday. He's been doing that for several years now. And also a thank you to Dave Fabiano and his crew for helping us produce the show. And we are at the Northern Berkshire Community Television Corporation. And we are normally seen on the public access channel 1301.
All right.
Have no idea what time, but I understand it's filtered over the week.
Yes.
So,
well,
anyway.
This weekend I listened to a couple of podcasts, and one of them was the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and he had a guest on there, and they talked about stock buybacks, and it was very enlightening to me because I had heard the term, but
I've heard it several times.
But I've really never delved into learning about it. So we have a few videos. The first video that we're going to show is from a group called the More Perfect Union. It's a new nonprofit media organization on a mission to empower working people. And so in this, it says, why should you be mad about stock buybacks? Companies spent over $1 trillion on stock buybacks last year. Here's why that's terrible for our economy and for you. You've heard the term stock buybacks everywhere this year, in the airline industry, railroad industry, and oil and gas industry, in entertainment, and in food. But what you haven't heard is whether it's good or bad and why. So let's listen to that first video.
Stock buybacks, a phrase that may mystify the public, but for those in finance, it's a superpower.
We are tracking stock buybacks.
The comeback of the buyback.
Chevron plans a massive $75 billion buyback.
The buyback, it was juicy. Everyone was excited about the buyback.
You're stepping up buybacks. You've laid off 10% of the workforce.
Look, we're still getting started here at Salesforce.
Over $1 trillion was invested in stock buybacks last year. Trillion, with a T. So why is everyone obsessed with stock buybacks? That's one of the hottest debates on Wall Street right now. Are stock buybacks just a smart tactic to improve shareholder value? Or are they a fancy bit of market magic?
Wingardium Leviosa.
A trick to enrich wealthy insiders at the expense of workers and the country's future. I'm Eric Gardner, and I cover business at More Perfect Union. Today, we're going to unpack stock buybacks. A standard definition of stock buybacks goes something like this. When companies have extra money, management takes the excess cash and purchases its own shares from the stock market. When they do this, the number of shares on the market is reduced. This often boosts a metric called earnings per share. When metrics like earnings per share increase, investors decide that the stock is worth more. So the stock price rises. Some of that might sound like gibberish. So try to think of stock buybacks as a big pot of soup. The fewer people that can eat out of it, the bigger the servings will be. For everyone that has a bowl, the pot of soup just got more valuable, even though the amount of soup in the pot is exactly the same. The soup doesn't taste better, there's not more soup, all of the perceived value increase is on paper. If this sounds ridiculous, it's because it kind of is. It's why so many people consider stock buybacks nothing more than financial engineering. Proponents, who are mostly large shareholders, love buybacks. They get more soup without having to spend more money. Here's an example. From 2018 to 2020, Apple spent $200 billion buying back around 2.5 billion shares worth of stock. So what that means is, if you're a regular investor with, let's say, 10 shares of Apple stock, you used to own 10 out of 20 billion shares. After Apple bought back its stock, you now own 10 out of 17.5 billion. That's immaterial. You might as well be some dandruff on Tim Cook's shoulder. But if you're Warren Buffett, whose company Berkshire Hathaway owned around 1 billion shares of Apple stock, it's worth billions. The company actually saw its ownership share of Apple increase despite selling $11 billion worth of stock during that time. Because of stock buybacks, Berkshire Hathaway shareholders found themselves owning 10% more of Apple without spending a penny. Now's the time when you're probably asking yourself, how is this allowed? Well, for decades, it was actually a big no-no for companies to purchase their own stocks.
3 years of unprecedented depression have brought poverty and hunger.
Buybacks helped cause the Great Depression, so the government recognized the practice for what it was, market manipulation. They passed a law to ban stock buybacks. But then, in 1982, a man named John Shad entered the chat. He's an unelected bureaucrat in the Reagan administration, and he had a brilliant insight. When it comes to business, shareholders are all that matter. Buybacks meant higher stock prices and more money for shareholders. So, buybacks were good. And just like that, they were legal. As weird as it sounds, this shuffling of paper transformed America. Once upon a time, there was a pact between American corporations and the country that sustained them. A promise to not only make money, but also to reinvest in the future. Innovating new technologies, erecting new factories, and creating much-needed, well-paying jobs. And there was still a place for shareholders in all of this. They were paid in dividends, a way for a company to reward long-term investing.
Directors determine the amount of dividends, if any, to be paid out of earnings to the stockholders.
But with the return of stock buybacks, shareholders could make big money by selling, not investing, at the new inflated prices. In the early 90s, executives preferred dividends to buybacks by about a 2-to-1 ratio. Now it's almost the opposite. Long-term investing is out of fashion. So is investing in workers in the future. Just take a look at this chart. In 1994, major companies were dropping over $6 on physical equipment for every dollar they spent on stock buybacks. Nowadays, they're only shelling out 94 cents on new stuff for every dollar they spend buying back their own shares. It turns out there's a personal reason why buybacks became so prevalent. Executives got in on the deal. Company boards, who are often paid with stock, started to tie executive compensation to stock performance. The idea is that an executive and the board will be more committed to the company if they have a direct financial stake in its value. But in practice, it means that the people who are deciding where the money is spent get more money if they spend it on stock buybacks, even if that comes at the expense of the long-term health of the business.
The truth is, if you look back, and I was director of the company, but Coca-Cola kept repurchasing their shares at a time when it didn't make sense if you look at it.
That's Warren Buffett. He's admitting that when he was on the board of Coca-Cola, they bought back stock when it wasn't in the company's best financial interest. So why didn't he say anything?
They made me a ton of money, and if you belch too often at the dinner table, you don't get invited to parties anymore.
That's a pretty big corporate governance problem, and it's also among the major drivers of income inequality. The year before buybacks were legal, the median CEO to worker pay ratio was 40-to-1. In 2020, it was 350-to-1. The dramatic rise of stock buybacks isn't some unavoidable circumstance. This is a choice that we're all living with. Nowhere is this more apparent than in energy. Energy giant Chevron made headlines when they announced plans to invest $10 billion in low-carbon energy by 2028. A year later, management turned around and announced they would spend $75 billion on stock buybacks, or about $17 billion a year for the foreseeable future. If money talks, then it's telling us the priorities of Chevron. Not a higher paid workforce or affordable energy, not clean energy technology that could help save the planet and make billions in the process. It's stock buybacks. So where do we go from here? There are 3 different camps of people who are grappling with this question. The first camp views buybacks as a superpower. Everything is fine the way it is because corporations exist to benefit shareholders, and buybacks benefit shareholders. The second camp says that we need to tax buybacks. A pretty diverse set of people take this view.
You know, no one's a fan of more taxes, but of all the taxes you're trying to create, I think a tax on buybacks is a good idea, actually.
They acknowledge that buybacks are causing harm by failing to invest in workers or the future.
They use the record profits to buy back their own stock, rewarding the CEOs and shareholders. Corporations ought to do the right thing.
This approach is gaining momentum. There was a provision in the Inflation Reduction Act that added a 1% tax on buybacks. It had a limited impact on corporate behavior. But now, there's talk about upping it to 4%.
That's why I propose we quadruple the tax on corporate stock buybacks and encourage long-term investments.
Most experts agree that this would actually change some behavior. The last camp is pushing for a simpler solution: ban stock buybacks. They can point to nearly 50 years of history as precedent. But that doesn't mean they won't face an uphill battle politically. Wherever you fall on the spectrum, it's important that we have this conversation. Because if we don't, unelected bureaucrats like John Shad will answer for us. And we won't like the results.
Oh, that was pretty good.
That was very good.
You know, I know a little bit more about buybacks now.
I do. Yes, I know a little bit more. I didn't see how it was any good for the actual employees of a company.
Yeah, and it's not even good for all the shareholders.
No.
Because what happens is you have to know when they're going to buy it back, the exact day.
Right. And
So those in the know when to sell their shares because they know when the company's buying them back. Other people don't.
Right.
So there's, you know.
So the little person who's probably got 10 doesn't know, and therefore he's still holding on to his 10 in the buyback. Now, he might benefit a little bit because this thing bumps up, but it's nothing like getting the trillions of dollars or whatever the company is giving to its shareholders. When I was reading this a little bit on the internet, one of the prime tactics is that consolidates the power within the company as well, and supposedly into fewer and fewer people's hands, because they're taking it off the public access and putting it back in. The company now owns those shares rather than people spread out.
I had a family member that was was a corporate member of a big organization, and he said they used to give the person $1 million when they became a corporate member, but now they give you stock.
Right. Knowing that you're going to get more than $1 million.
But you're going to be voting to do things
that
are
good for the company?
No, that you're going to be good for you. Buy back.
Buy back.
Buy back. Right. It's not like having someone on the line who's working at the bottom rung on the board of directors.
No,
you know,
no.
Why don't we? I want to talk some more about it, but let's listen to another video. This is Professor Wolf, who looks into the policy of stock buybacks, and he used to be a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. It's called The Stock Buyback Swindle: Economic Update with Richard Wolf. So,
I want to turn next to stock buybacks. I want to make sure everyone understands it, because if you do, it gives you a window into another aspect of capitalism that will make you critical. Trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars are spent in the United States. Probably every year, but certainly every other year, if you put 2 years together, on buying back stock. What does that mean? It means take a company, I'll pick one, General Motors. The board of directors, those 15 or so people that make all these kinds of decisions and allow no one else, by the way, to do so, the board of directors decides to take a chunk of its profits, not invest them in a better car, not hire anybody, none of that, but instead to use billions of dollars from their profits to go into the stock market and buy shares of their own company, General Motors shares, perhaps shares owned by your grandmother, perhaps shares owned by your bank, the usual. Why would they do that? Because the company, by bringing in big purchase orders for General Motors shares, will drive up the price of General Motors shares on the stock market. And you know who that's going to make happy? All the shareholders, All the people who own shares of General Motors, seeing its price go up, will get big smiles. As I've told you many times, 10% of the people in this country, the richest 10%, own 80% of the shares. So if you do stock buyback, the biggest beneficiary are the shareholders. How quaint. You know who's among the top 10% of our people? The members of the board of directors of General Motors who make the decision. So when they raise the price of the shares, they are helping themselves as shareholders. But it's worse. For many top executives, their pay package is dependent on how well the stock does. So if the stock goes up, they get more salary. So there's another incentive. And what have they done with this incentive? They've taken it a step further. In recent years, more and more large corporations are borrowing money to buy back their own shares. In other words, they're loading up their company with debt. They don't care. After a few years, they won't be the chief executive of that company. They'll go on and up the chain or retire. They're loading up the company with debt to drive up the price, which gives them a bigger salary and a bigger wealth because they own such shares. And by the way, who produced the profit that the company had? Of course, all the people who work at General Motors. All of them. But the vast majority of them have nothing to say about what is done with the profits. They wouldn't use them to boost the share prices because they don't own any shares, and their wages are not dependent on the value of the shares. That's just the top. They're taking care of themselves, in short. The job of the mass of the people is to come to work, do the work, produce the goods, generate the profits, and then shut up so that the tiny group at the top, the executives at the top, the major shareholders, can use that money to buy back their shares in the stock market and boost their wealth and boost their income. What a system. It's the most undemocratic imaginable. All the other things the corporation could and should do. Remember the next time a corporate executive refers to himself or herself as a job creator. Buying back your shares creates no jobs at all.
Very true.
Yeah.
Does not create any. And by borrowing, you're adding more risk to the company. So eventually it could go bankrupt, and everybody's out. Now you're out of a job.
Right. They
If
don't
you're
care,
working
though,
for the
but
company.
they got their stock money.
They got their
buyback.
stock money, so they don't care.
Well, we have one more, and this was the guest that was on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. It's economic expert Bill Lazonick. He talks about GE stock buybacks put workers last. It says, eminent economist and academic industrial research network president, Dr. William Lazonick, explains how General Electric focuses on stock buybacks has hurt the GE U.S. competitiveness, the workers. Lazonick demands an end to the predatory financial practices putting Wall Street hedge funds and other speculators ahead of workers and the nation in the national interest. So let's take a look at what Bill Lazonick has to say.
Hello, it's great to be with you. So why is inequality extreme in the United States? And why is employment for so many Americans unstable and tenuous? And why does the U.S. lag China and Europe in many critical new technologies? The basic answer, predatory value extraction. The nation's business corporations are being systematically looted. In some cases, the looting occurs out of regulatory sight by private equity managers who buy up the shares of publicly listed companies, take them off the stock market, load them with debt, downsize the labor force, all for the sake of making the private equity managers incredibly rich by paying them massive dividends. In other cases, the looting takes place in plain regulatory sight, in fact, with regulatory approval, by publicly listed corporations that do massive stock buybacks to manipulate the company's stock price, thereby enriching corporate managers with their stock-based pay and hedge fund managers who time the buying and selling of corporate shares. The Academic Industry Research Network, the nonprofit I lead, dissects predatory value extraction of publicly listed companies. From 2010 to 2020, S&P 500 companies did $5.4 trillion in buybacks, 57% of the profits, in addition to $3.9 trillion in dividends, another 42% of profits. That left about 1% to reward the company's employees for the value-creating work that made the profits possible and for increased investment in the productive capabilities to generate innovative products. Worse yet, corporate managers who do massive buybacks seek to increase profits by price gouging customers and suppressing workers' wages, thus funding even more buybacks so that even more cash can flow into their bank accounts and those of hedge fund managers. Since the mid-1990s, 1980s, I should say, under Jack Welch and Jeffrey Immelt, GE was a leader in doing stock buybacks. Under Immelt, from 2002 to 2015, GE wasted $57 billion in buybacks, 29% of profits, in addition to 61% on dividends. In October 2015, Nelson Peltz disclosed that his hedge fund, Trian Partners, had purchased $2.5 billion of GE stock, about 0.9% of GE's outstanding shares. Trian claimed to be engaged in constructive dialogue with GE and that by taking Trian's advice, GE could boost its stock price to $45 by 2017. That would enable Trian to turn $2.5 billion into $4.5 billion. And note that not 1 cent of the $2.5 billion with which Trian purchased GE shares on the market was invested in GE's productive capabilities. The hoped-for gains would be nothing but predatory value extraction. Immelt and his CFO told the Wall Street Journal that they were completely aligned on the levers, the quote, suggested by Trian to increase GE's stock price. Immelt stated, quote, the buyback opportunity is right in front of us, quote. In 2016, GE paid $8.8 billion in dividends. It's the first year that Trian held the shares, full year. A shade under 100% of profits, plus $22.6 billion in buybacks, another 256% of profits. Nevertheless, in early 2017, Peltz let it be known that CEO Immelt had not done enough to increase the GE stock price. And by June, Immelt announced, with Peltz's boot in his backside, that he was retiring as CEO. In October 2017, Peltz got GE to put his son-in-law and Trian partner Edward Garden on the company's board. From 2016 to 2021, GE's revenues dropped from $120 billion to $74 billion, and its worldwide employment plunged from 333,000 to 168,000. Over the years 2017 to 21, the company's losses totaled $37 billion. In November 2021, as many people have commented, GE announced its proposed breakup into 3 companies engaged in energy, medical equipment, and aviation. The same industrial activities, by the way, on which from the late 19th century, the company had been built. With GE's depressed stock price still representing about 5% of Trian's portfolio, Peltz and Garden have pushed for the GE breakup as a way of creating shareholder value for themselves. How then, with less than 1% of GE's outstanding shares, have Peltz and Garden been able to exercise so much power over GE's resource allocation? For the full story, please read my book, Predatory Value Extraction, How the Looting of the Business Corporation Became the U.S. Norm and How Sustainable Prosperity Can Be Restored. But here it is in short form. First, corporate managers of value extracting insiders aligned with the hedge fund managers as value extracting outsiders in using tens of billions of dollars of the corporation's dollars to do buybacks to manipulate the company's stock price. Second, the U.S. Labor Department and SEC rulings from the late 1980s to the early 2000s have empowered hedge fund managers to assert corporate control by lining up the proxy votes of asset managers who, as value extracting enablers, are seeking higher yields on their portfolio. Third, the National Securities Markets Improvement Act of 1996 permits a hedge fund to have more than 99 asset managers or rich individuals as investors in its fund without being regulated by the Investment Company Act and Investment Advisors Act. which would prohibit the hedge fund from directly engaging a corporation in a predatory campaign and placing its own representatives on the corporation's board. That, in a nutshell, is why there are predatory value extractors in the boardrooms of major U.S. corporations, doing billions upon billions of dollars of buybacks to loot the revenues created by employees' skills and efforts. So how do we stop the looting? Ban buybacks, put employee representatives on corporate boards, and bar the predatory value extractors. Thank you.
Sounds like 3 good suggestions.
They are. Getting them could be a little complicated.
Well,
obviously, public pressure from below can get an actual law passed, not a rule, so that the next person in can. I mean, Biden could, in theory, reinstitute that rule, but then the person following him could take it away. So you need it to be a law to make it permanent.
Right. But
to
first,
ban
we have
buybacks.
to educate ourselves to what's going on. I mean, GE was such a vital part of this community.
It was for a long time.
There were a lot of jobs. People made a lot of money, middle-class jobs.
Half my family worked at GE.
Right.
And made a good living.
And the money that they had, they didn't put it in foreign bank accounts. They invested it in the community.
Right.
And they paid taxes.
And they did. The employees did.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know what the
GE, no.
GE in general,
but the employees did.
But the employees did.
Instead, in the 1980s, they made the shift that let's just take every little bit of profit and let's put it in our pockets, not invest it into the future and into our employees.
Right.
And that happened in Sprague's in the 80s. It happened at the Arnold Printworks.
In the 80s.
All these businesses,
suddenly they didn't have money anymore to invest or to
the jobs went overseas that were necessary. So
and that same thing happened because my brother Peter started working in Pittsfield. By the end, he had to move start commuting to Schenectady for his last 5 years, and he went through probably 4 layoffs in his time frame simply because we don't have profit now. We're going to downsize, and he was lucky to get hired back 3 times,
Right.
But because he was working in that period of the 80s and 90s.
Right, because the workers had a union.
Right.
And they had protection.
They had some protection.
They did have some protection, but not like a lot of other businesses.
No.
So we have to continue to educate ourselves on these topics. I know economics is something that, it's
a lot
not,
of us want to forget about.
Right. We don't want to know those terms and the jargon. It's all about jargon. You come down to it, all these things, it's greed. There's people that are greedy. They're looking at the short term. All they care about is themselves. They don't agree in democratic process. They don't want democratic participation of the people who work at the workplace. They want democracy outside of the workplace. They don't want it anywhere near the work. Right. I remember we studied the cooperatives in Mondragon in Spain. That was profits. The only reason why we should have profits is to employ more people. That's why. You get the profits, you employ more people. So let's get the power to the people.
All right, and we will see you next week. Thank you for watching.
There's power in a factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in a union. Now the lessons of the past are all learned with workers' blood. Mistakes of the bosses we must pay for. From the cities and the farmlands to trenches